Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. Do these names sound familiar? Watsontown, Hartville, Greenock? They don't? Maybe that's because the single place that at one time or another held each of these names is now called something else. Today we're talking about Washington, Massachusetts. Not to be confused with Mount Washington, Massachusetts, which is also in the Berkshires, but at the far southwestern corner. We'll have an episode about that sometime in the future, but rather Washington, Massachusetts, home of most of October Mountain State Forest. The town suffered a few false starts, thus the name changes. It was uncertain for a time who held the grant, or if the Native Americans of the region had been properly paid for the area. Then, the question was whether they had anyone willing to live there, which without there could be no town. But after some shuffling about, the problems were sorted out, and the town was settled in 1760. It wasn't officially incorporated until 1777, and it didn't get its current name until 1784, which means that it was named for George Washington during his lifetime, as he didn't pass until 1799. People made their way up the mountain that runs north to south and has a long flat ridge. They built upon that ridge homes and soon bustling farms with livestock and crops planted on the rocky, shallow, mountaintop soil appeared upon the plateau. They built schools and churches, a little meeting house. The community seemed fit and thriving. During the Revolutionary War, Minutemen would drill on the local parade grounds. These were the 10 acres around the meeting house. During times of war, soldiers from Washington would meet with those from Becket and walk to the battles of Lexington, Bunker Hill, and Yorktown. Even at that time, the town was well connected with the rest of the country. News spread quite rapidly. In 1777, the Battle of Bennington began, and the men from Washington responded. They hurried north to help drive the British away. But this battle meant more to the people of the Berkshires than perhaps the rest of the state, because Bennington is very close to the Berkshire line, and not at all that far from Washington itself. The threat was close and very real. Not far away, in the town of Sheffield, a slave woman named Bet was present during a public gathering when in 1780 the newly ratified Massachusetts Constitution was read aloud. It included the words, "All men are born free and equal, and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness." Bet may not have been able to read or write, but she was smart and promptly sued her owners for her freedom. In August 1781, she won her case in Great Barrington and changed her name to Elizabeth Freeman. This court decision, however, meant that it was suddenly unlawful to own slaves in the state. Slaves in nearby states, where it remained legal longer, began to run away from their owners and take refuge in Massachusetts. So many came to Washington that small villages of little cottages seemed to pop up overnight to house them, and the former slaves would work among the community to earn a little money while they tried to figure out where to go next and what to do. The old stage route from Hartford to Albany used to run through the town on its way toward Pittsfield, and long ago it would have been the lifeblood of the town. After some time, the Pontusic Turnpike was built, a slightly more direct route through the lower village, the easternmost village of the town, but at a lower elevation, which was easier on the horses. It's still there as our modern Route 8. We must remember that there simply weren't as many roads back then, and that anyone traveling between these points would have had to travel through Washington. People would want to rest, and there was the need to switch horses at one of the 2 rallying stables in town. So when they came across taverns, shops, and inns, it was a boost to the economy. Soon enough, however, the era of rail travel began, and the time of stagecoach voyages and country taverns was at an end. Then slowly, but of course too quickly for any place once so sure of its prosperous future, the town of Washington began to fall apart. A book called Carriage Driving in Western Massachusetts, written by Clark V. Bryan, Bryan is spelt with a Y, and published in 1890, has a description about the town. The author tells a tale of how the keeper of an inn in Becket took him up to the once bustling but now deserted upper village on the mountain, but then says he'll save further description for another paper. Obviously struck by the sight, he was true to his word, and 2 years later, in 1892, he continues his story and calls Washington a most completely obliterated Berkshire hill town. After making a return journey of a carriage drive among the Berkshires, and after spending a night at the Cliflin House in Becket, he was brought to the deserted village by the landlord of the inn. Our objective point for the morning, he says, was to spot where the village of Washington once stood, on top of Washington Mountain, then a populous, wealthy, hill-town village, of much local possessions and great fame abroad in the land, but now not even a mountain hamlet. Decay and desolation abandoning were once landscape, both on the mountain top and down in the hillside roadway, for miles to the north and south, he continues. Gaping cellar holes stare at passers-by with the gaze of a silent solemnity, at once pathetic and depressing. He also says, a dilapidated, falling, crumbling edifice bearing evidence of once being kept well painted and well cared for. Crowning the hill is the shattered remains of what was once the village church of Washington Center. Once half a double door, unhinged and falling, leaves no obstruction to the entrance of man or beast to these sacred precincts. A portion of the roof had fallen inward. Another portion has been carried by the mountain winds into an adjoining field. Then later he goes on. So utterly gone is this church edifice, and so completely wiped out is this society once worshipping within its walls, that a fund of $5,000 left for its care and perpetuation of the church by the late Governor E.D. Morgan of New York, a native of Washington, finds no clement, for the simple fact that the building is already wrecked beyond repair, and the worshipping society has become utterly extinct. He says that across the street from the church stands the parsonage, in the same decrepit state. What killed this farming community? Mostly, the Berkshires. The county is known for its gentle mountains and hills, which people are naturally drawn to for their beauty and views. But to try to farm a mountaintop plateau is difficult at best. Despite that, many farms held on for a long time, by planting tougher crops, diversifying the sources of their incomes, or just good luck. But time and hardship makes people dream of other opportunities, so families began to leave, until there were none. Where did they go? Well, with the invention of new, more efficient farming machinery, many left for the vast and flat West, where huge patchworks of fields could be tilled for optimal yield, so very different from the small hand-worked clearings of Washington. But the old farmers didn't just abandon their homes. They sold them to new hopeful families. However, those people soon discovered the same problems, and after a few turnovers, these new owners, with not such a concern for the welfare and future of the town, left the buildings to rot. But wait, is the town totally gone? No. A village of the town is gone. The village on the western side of town, where the mountain rises highest and the weather is the harshest. The village, the lower village, on the eastern side of town, still survives. But the turnover of residents was at one time so constant that even in the surviving village, where the climate is gentler, that it inspired Mrs. Lewis Elliott to write in her book entitled 1777 to 1977, 200 Years, The History of the Town of Washington, Massachusetts, there is no family in the town with a thread through all our past. In 1853, the writer Herman Melville dubbed the mountain he could see from the window of his home in Pittsfield with the name October Mountain, and it stuck, even after the upper village had fallen to the elements. Mr. George Crane built St. Andrew's Chapel in 1899 as a gift to the town. It was constructed only a little ways from his estate called Bucksteep Manor. In 1859, Senator Thomas Post began buying large amounts of land, farm and fields, homes and wetlands. He bought them all, and just as fast as people would sell to him. After a few years of this, it was finally discovered that Mr. Post was actually working for General George Whitney, and in the end was able to purchase 14,000 acres. It seemed that William Whitney, his son, had always loved the area and wanted to establish a game reserve and estate atop the mountain. William C. Whitney had been President Grover Cleveland's Secretary of the Navy. In the end, he'd bought 42 farms. The buildings on most of them were leveled. The Morgan Tavern that had been on one of those lots was moved to stand near his home. He had already owned 10 other homes, but it would seem that that simply wasn't enough. Other than the common animals found on a fully functioning estate, like horses, cows, and sheep, William Whitney also kept a large number of elk and bison. He acquired some antelope, but those didn't survive the Berkshire winter. He brought up Virginia deer, 2 moose, and 10 black-tailed deer. The home he'd build in the center of this all would be called the Antlers. Much later, when the estate would be abandoned, the moose and the types of deer would be set free upon the mountain to roam as they pleased. One of the moose, Old Bill, liked to wander into Lee or up Main Street in Lenox, but he'd always return to the old estate, over and over. In 1920, he was illegally shot and killed in Otis. His body was found and his head was mounted. His head still resides in the Berkshire Museum in Pittsfield. At its largest, Mr. Whitney owned more land in Massachusetts than any other citizen. But in 1903, his wife died shortly after taking a spill from the back of her horse. In 1904, he himself died. He was 62. His children nor other relatives wanted to take care of running the property. Most of the animals were shipped off to other places, and after a decade of neglect, the state started buying back the land. The purchase of the initial 11,000 acres was made in 1915 for a total of $60,000, part of which came through the pledge of a group of Berkshire residents. The area was opened to the public later that year, with a new name, October Mountain State Forest. The state began improvements which included tearing down the rotting buildings, which meant the antlers as well. In 1930, the Civilian Conservation Corps improved upon it even further by constructing more modern camping and recreation facilities, including trails. One trail that slices through the property is the Appalachian Trail that runs all the way from Georgia to Maine. On the other side of town, the lower village still managed to survive. Roads were paved over time and telephone lines came. But the Great Depression took its toll too. More people left. The fields grew over to forest. Many of the vistas so prized by the town on high were lost. During World War II, the old town hall was used as a lookout to keep an eye on the sky in case of enemy planes. The building had windows on all 4 sides, which made for a great vantage point from its spot high up on the mountain. Back then it was thought that the threat of an enemy attack on the homeland was very possible. The little town ordered blackouts at night and had watches patrol to make sure everyone was following the rules. After the war, there were more improvements, such as the building of a new school. To accommodate people more comfortably, the town meetings would be held there instead of the old town hall. And in 1965, the old town hall was in such a shambles that it was considered for demolition. But a group called the Sons and Daughters of Washington won out and saved the historic structure from ruin. It is now under the protection of the Washington Historical Committee. The Sons and Daughters consist of anyone who's ever lived in Washington, Massachusetts, or are descended from anyone who ever did. If you're one of those people, you're invited. Visit the town's website for information. And for everyone else, the town is a scenic delight. I encourage people to take a drive and explore. October Mountain State Forest is also a great place to hike, swim, explore the stone walls and cellar holes of the past, as well as perhaps experience a little something strange. What's that, you ask? I think I'll save those stories for our next episode. This has been The Berkshires Gone By. Created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Renier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. If you'd like to contact us, find more episodes, or see images related to our topics, please visit our Facebook page. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Thanks for listening.